She had given him 7 years. 7 years of standing in the dark corners of ballrooms while he shone. 7 years of swallowing her own ambitions like medicine that tasted of nothing good. 7 years of believing that devotion, real devotion, the kind that costs you something, was the currency that bought a future. Lady Seraphina Vale had been wrong about the exchange rate. The morning the announcement appeared in the Royal Gazette, she read it 3 times. Not because the words were unclear, because some part of her brain refused to accept that a man could spend 7 years learning the exact weight of a woman's loyalty, then hand it to someone else like a coat he'd grown tired of wearing. Duke Adrian Blackthorne was to be married to Princess Isadora of Valdenmoor. The union, described in careful diplomatic prose, represented a significant strengthening of cross-border alliance and mutual prosperity. 7 years. And she hadn't even earned a conversation. Stay with it. Stay with Seraphina until the very end. What happens next will change everything you think you know about what a woman can survive and what she can become. The Vale family townhouse on Cresthaven Row had 17 rooms, and Seraphina had memorized the particular silence of each one. The parlor at the end of the east corridor held a silence that smelled faintly of dried lavender and old paper. The smell of her mother's reading hours, now years gone. The library carried a silence dense with the sound of arguments that had stopped mid-sentence. And her own bedroom, the one she'd slept in since she was 6 years old, held the precise silence of a woman who had just been informed that the future she had structured her entire self around no longer existed. She folded the Gazette with both hands, set it on the dressing table, looked at her own face in the mirror without particular feeling. The woman looking back was 28, which in the reckoning of Aldenmoor's aristocratic circles placed her somewhere between enviably young and dangerously past the age of effortless eligibility. Dark hair, gray eyes that people had described at various points in her life as striking, unsettling, and in one memorable instance from a particularly wine-loosened baroness, the color of a winter morning before the sun decides whether or not to bother. High cheekbones. A mouth that sat in a state of natural composure that some people mistook for coldness, and others, the ones worth knowing, eventually understood was simply the face of a woman who had learned not to broadcast everything she felt. 7 years, and now this. She thought of Adrian's hands first, not his face, not his voice. His hands, specifically, because that was what she had studied during the moments that mattered. The way they rested against a desk when he was working through a problem, the particular tension in his knuckles when a conversation was heading somewhere he didn't want it to go. She had learned to read him through his hands the way a physician reads a patient's pulse. Quickly. Accurately. Without sentimentality. And he had let her build that fluency. He had permitted her to become an expert in him, which was its own form of intimacy, its own kind of promise. You do not allow someone to study you that closely unless some part of you intends for them to stay. Or perhaps you do. Perhaps some people simply enjoyed being known without the inconvenience of being chosen. She stood up from the dressing table and walked to the window. Below, Cresthaven Row moved through its morning business without any awareness that the world had just been reorganized. A greengrocer's cart rattled past. 2 boys chased something small and fast along the gutter. A woman in a gray shawl paused at the corner, consulting a folded note, and then walked on. Seraphina watched them and felt the first clear thought arrive through the fog of the past hour. She was going to have to attend the Hartwell reception tonight, because she had already accepted the invitation 3 weeks ago, before the Gazette, before Princess Isadora of Valdenmoor had become a name Seraphina would now hear for the rest of her life. And because not attending would mean something. Not attending would mean that every person in that room would understand she had read the announcement and retreated, which was the same as bleeding in public, which was something she had decided at age 14 she would never do. She turned from the window and went to dress. The Hartwell reception occupied the first 3 floors of Lord Hartwell's Meridian Street residence, which had been built by his grandfather during a period of extraordinary family wealth and subsequently decorated by successive generations with the particular chaos of people who had money but no coherent aesthetic philosophy. The result was a house that felt simultaneously grand and bewildering, enormous oil portraits of ancestors who bore no resemblance to anyone currently alive jostling against silk wallpapers in 3 competing shades of green. Seraphina arrived at 8:30 in a gown the color of deep water. Not black, which would have read as drama. Not a softer color, which would have read as fragility. The blue-gray of it sat exactly at the intersection of composure and authority, which was where she intended to remain all evening. She gave her cloak to a footman, accepted a glass of champagne she didn't intend to drink, and stepped into the main reception room. The temperature of the room changed when she entered. She felt it. Not warmth, not cold, but the particular shift in atmospheric pressure that occurred when a room full of people who knew something turned to observe the person who had just become the subject of their knowing. Heads turned with the rehearsed casualness of people who had been watching the door for the last hour. Conversations adjusted their volume in the way that conversations did when they were about to incorporate new material. She kept her face easy. She kept her shoulders level. She took a single deliberate sip of the champagne she hadn't planned to drink, because the gesture gave her hands something to do and her eyes somewhere to look, and she moved further into the room. Lady Cressida Pemberton reached her first. Cressida was a woman of 50 with the social precision of someone who had spent 3 decades cultivating exactly the right mixture of warmth and calculation, and her expression now was a masterwork of sympathetic concern arranged to look spontaneous. "Serafina, darling." She clasped both of Serafina's hands in hers. "You came." The "you came" carried an entire conversation inside it. The "you came" said, "We didn't think you would." The "you came" said, "The announcement was in the Morning Gazette, and here you are, in this room at 8:30, which is either extraordinary courage or extraordinary stubbornness, and we haven't decided which yet." The "you came" said, "Tell us how you are," by which we mean tell us everything, by which we mean give us something to discuss after you've moved away. "Of course I came," Serafina said. "Lord Hartwell's cook makes a walnut pastry that I would endure considerably worse than a Wednesday evening for." Cressida's smile sharpened with something that was almost genuine appreciation. "You look wonderful." "Thank you. The wallpaper in the East Corridor is doing extraordinary things tonight." She moved on before the conversation could find its footing. That was the technique. Never hold still long enough for sympathy to calcify into pity. Pity was the thing she could not afford. Pity required a response, required you to perform gratitude for someone else's concern, required a kind of emotional housekeeping she didn't have the reserves for tonight. She worked the room methodically. She spoke to Lord Hartwell about the drainage legislation currently moving through Parliament, which he found genuinely interesting and which no one would have expected her to know anything about, which was precisely why she knew it. She discussed the upcoming autumn season with Viscountess Marrow in enough detail to signal that her calendar remained full and her social life intact. She made the Harrington twins laugh with an observation about the portrait of the third Lord Hartwell, which looked, she pointed out, exactly like a man who had swallowed something he deeply regretted and had decided to be documented in that precise emotional moment. She was very good at this. She had been good at it for years, this particular performance of ease, and the fact that tonight the performance was costing her more than usual was not something that showed. She made sure it didn't show. Then Adrian walked in. He came with his secretary, Dobbins, a narrow man with quick eyes and the permanent air of someone composing a list, and 2 members of his household staff. No Princess Isadora. She was still in Valdenmoor, presumably being fitted for whatever wardrobe a foreign princess required when crossing a border to marry a duke. Adrian himself wore charcoal and silver, which suited him in the way that most things suited him, because Adrian Blackthorne was the kind of man around whom aesthetic choices resolved into correctness simply by virtue of his proximity to them. He was 41. Dark hair with the first touches of gray at the temples. A face that had started as conventionally handsome and had been refined over the years into something more interesting. The kind of face that required understanding to read, that revealed nothing in a single glance and everything over the course of an evening. Serafina had once considered herself fluent in that face. She watched him from across the room as he moved through the greetings, the handshakes, the choreography of social arrival. He hadn't seen her yet, or if he had, he was better at the performance than she'd credited him for. She turned away and set down her champagne glass on a passing tray. "Serafina," his voice, behind her. Closer than she'd expected, which meant he'd moved quickly, which meant he'd seen her the moment he entered and had done the calculus, and decided to make the approach himself rather than let the room watch them navigate around each other all evening. She turned. "Adrian," she said. Up close, he looked, and she cataloged this with the same precision with which she cataloged everything. Tired. Not the tiredness of a man who hadn't slept. The deeper kind. The tiredness of someone who had made a decision and was now living in the early hours of its consequences. "You look well," he said. "Thank you. I wasn't sure you'd be here tonight." "Why wouldn't I be?" He held her gaze. He was one of the few people who could do that without it becoming a competition. Just held it, level and steady, the way he'd always been able to, as though the space between them was something he'd measured and found manageable. "I wanted to speak with you," he said. "Before you heard it through." "I read the Gazette this morning," she said. "Over breakfast. The announcement was very clearly written." Something moved across his face. Not guilt exactly. Something older than guilt. Something that had the shape of understanding arrived at too late to be useful. "Serafina, congratulations on the engagement," she said. "I understand Princess Isadora is accomplished in several languages and has an extraordinary collection of Valdemorian manuscripts. You'll have much to discuss." "That's not—" He stopped, started again. "I owe you an explanation." "You owe me nothing," she said, and meant it in both directions. In the direction of no debt acknowledged, and in the direction of he had used up what was owed. "That isn't true, and you know it." "What I know," she said carefully, "is that this is not the appropriate venue for the conversation you seem to want to have. And I suspect if you think about it, you'll realize you don't actually want to have it. You want to have a version of it in which I make this easier for you. And I'm afraid I'm not going to do that." He was quiet for a moment. Around them, the room had perfected the art of watching without appearing to watch. Conversations angled carefully, eyes moving in peripheral arcs. "You're not going to make anything easy, are you?" he said. It wasn't quite a question. "I never have," she said. "You knew that. It was part of what you—" She stopped, recalibrated. "It doesn't matter." "It does matter." "Adrian." Her voice was quiet and very controlled. "Please don't tell me what matters. Not tonight." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, very quietly, the thing she hadn't expected him to say. "I know what I've done." She held the eye contact, didn't let anything shift in her face, didn't let him see what those 4 words cost her, which was more than anything else in the evening, more than the Gazette, more than the room watching, more than the 7 years compressing down into this single exchange. Because the thing about being told I know what I've done was that it didn't fix anything. It didn't reconstruct anything. All it did was confirm that the damage had been intentional, which was simultaneously the one thing she'd needed to know, and the one thing she would have been marginally better off not knowing. "Good night, Your Grace," she said. She turned and walked to the other side of the room without hurrying. She stayed another 40 minutes. She made sure of it. Made sure she laughed at Lord Dunmore's story about his hunting trip to the Northern Territories. Made sure she was seen examining Lord Hartwell's new acquisition with apparent interest. Made sure that when she finally took her leave, it read as the natural conclusion of an enjoyable evening and not as escape. In the carriage home, she sat with both hands folded in her lap and looked out at the dark streets and did not think about Adrian Blackthorne. She thought instead about her mother, who had died 6 years ago in this same house, who had spent the better part of her marriage to Serafina's father being managed and overlooked and ultimately, graciously, forgotten. Her mother had been a woman of considerable intelligence and very little authorized outlet for it, and the combination had done something to her, not broken her, not exactly, but compressed her, the way pressure compressed a substance into something denser and less yielding, until in the end she had simply taken up very little space. Serafina had decided at 14 that she would not do that. She had spent 7 years learning the ways in which that decision was more complicated than it sounded. She let herself into the house, dismissed the footman, climbed the stairs to her room, and sat at the dressing table and looked at her own face again in the mirror, and this time allowed herself the thing she hadn't allowed all evening. She felt it, not for long, not with any particular ceremony, just long enough to acknowledge that 7 years was a real thing, that the loss of a possible future was a real loss, that she was not required to process it with the efficiency of a business transaction simply because performing that efficiency was what the room had required of her tonight. Then she stopped. She folded the feeling up and put it away somewhere internal, and she went to the window, and she looked out at the city, and she thought, what next? Not what next in the emotional reckoning. That would come in its own time, in small increments, in moments she couldn't predict and couldn't prepare for. What next in the practical sense? What next in the sense of she was 28, she was the daughter of a viscount, she had 7 years of social and political expertise acquired in service of a future that no longer existed. And this was the part she turned over and examined with genuine curiosity. She was entirely unencumbered. For the first time in 7 years, she had nothing she was obligated to protect. No relationship whose stability required her constant management. No set of alliances that had been built for someone else's benefit. No emotional territory that wasn't entirely her own. It was a strange feeling, cleaner than she'd expected. She didn't sleep for a long time, but when she finally did, she didn't dream about Adrian. 2 weeks passed. She did not attend functions where Adrian was known to be present, not because she was hiding from him, but because the social geography of grief, she would allow herself that word, privately, required a period of renegotiation before the old territories became navigable again. She understood this about herself with clinical precision. She attended a lecture series on constitutional reform at the Meridian Institute. She began corresponding with Lady Forthright about a charitable trust for the education of girls from working households, something she had been meaning to do for 2 years and had never found the time for. She rode in Hyde Green Park most mornings at 7, before the more fashionable hour, because she had always preferred the park before it filled with people who wanted to be seen riding in it. She was, she told herself, rebuilding. She was, she told herself, moving forward, which was the only direction anyone could actually move. What she did not tell herself was that she was also quietly, methodically furious, that the fury lived inside her like a low-grade fire, not consuming, not irrational, just present, a constant, even heat. She had been useful to Adrian. She had been genuinely useful, not decoratively, not in the manner of a well-placed ornament who reflected credit onto its owner, but substantively, in the ways that actually mattered to a man with his level of political exposure. The Dunbar affair 3 years ago, when a faction of the Merchant Guild had been quietly moving to challenge the Blackthorn grain contracts, Serafina had identified the coordinating mechanism before Adrian's own advisors had understood a challenge was underway. The season before that, when Lord Cavendish had been positioning his eldest daughter as a rival social asset, Serafina had neutralized it with a finesse that Adrian had later described privately as almost frightening. She had been, in the functional vocabulary of the aristocratic world, an asset of extraordinary quality, and he had traded her for a foreign title and a set of political alliances that anyone paying attention could see were already beginning to show structural instability. Valdenmore's position in the Eastern trade agreements was more complicated than the official announcement suggested. Serafina had sources, old friends of her mother's who had married into diplomatic families, and what she was hearing about the Valdenmore situation didn't read like the stable foundation the engagement announcement implied. Adrian didn't know that, or if he did, he had decided the risk was acceptable, which was another data point in the emerging picture of a man who had looked at what he had and consistently valued what he didn't have more highly. She was thinking about this one morning in the park, walking the mare through the quiet section near the eastern ornamental lake, when a voice spoke from the path ahead. Lady Vale. She looked up. Crown Prince Lucian Ashford was sitting on a gray horse with the relaxed posture of someone who had been riding before he could walk, which, given that his father was King Aldrich and his childhood had been conducted largely between a palace and a series of royal hunting estates, was probably accurate. He was 34, with the particular quality of stillness that some people arrived at through training and others simply were born carrying. Brown hair, eyes that were a specific shade of amber green that people wrote about in slightly overwrought terms in the social pages, though Serafina had always found the commentary more interesting for what it revealed about the writers than about the eyes themselves. He was not accompanied by his usual military escort, which was unusual. There were 2 plainclothed attendants at a discreet distance, enough to satisfy the requirements of his security obligations without announcing his presence to anyone who wasn't looking carefully. "Your Royal Highness," she said, and brought the mare to a halt. "I've interrupted your thoughts," he said. "I apologize. You had the expression of someone doing serious internal work, and I've gone and broken the whole thing." She found herself caught slightly off guard by the directness of it, the casual accuracy of it. "I was thinking about trade agreements," she said. Which was true. One eyebrow moved. At 7 in the morning. The morning is when the thinking is cleanest. He regarded her for a moment with the same level unhurried attention she'd observed him using in the 3 or 4 social contexts in which they'd previously occupied the same room, always at the edge, always looking for the thing beneath the surface of whatever was being presented. People who didn't know him well assumed that quality was calculation. She had always thought it was something more like a genuine interest in what was actually happening, which was rarer and more valuable. "You used to attend the Morecastle lectures," he said, "on the Eastern trade routes. 2 years ago." She blinked very slightly. "You attended those?" "Briefly. I had competing obligations and missed most of the series. But I remember you asked a question about the distribution mechanisms in the second session that the lecturer spent the next 20 minutes unsuccessfully trying to deflect." "He didn't have a satisfactory answer," she said. "I thought someone should make that visible." "You made it quite visible," he said. There was no condescension in it. If anything, the tone was something closer to respect. "I thought about that question for weeks afterward, about the gap it identified." She looked at him. The morning light was soft and even, and the lake behind him caught it in long, flat reflections. Around them, the park was nearly empty, just the distant sound of a gardener somewhere in the tree line and the steady quiet of early morning. "The gap is still there," she said, "larger now, if anything." "I know," he said. "That's partly what I've been trying to think through." He paused. "Would you be willing to continue this conversation at some point under less informal circumstances? I have a working group on the Eastern trade architecture. It's small, deliberately, because I've found that the size of a working group tends to be inversely proportional to the quality of thinking it produces. You'd add something it currently lacks." She considered him. In 7 years of navigating the social and political architecture of Alden Moore's aristocracy, Serafina had developed a finely calibrated sense for the categories of invitation she received. There were invitations that were compliments dressed as requests. "Look how generous I am, including someone like you." There were invitations that were maneuvers. "I need something from you, and this is how I'm going to obtain it." There were invitations that were simply filling space, the social obligation of appearing to extend opportunity without any genuine intention behind it. This didn't feel like any of those. It felt like a man who had a problem and had identified, with some precision, someone who might be useful in solving it, and had decided to ask directly because indirect approaches were a waste of time he found valuable. "I'm not sure what I could add to a Crown Prince's working group," she said, because it was the honest question to ask. "You could ask the questions that deflate inadequate answers," he said, which, in my experience, is the single most useful contribution any person can make to any serious discussion. She almost smiled. "That's a fairly low bar for usefulness." "You'd be surprised how rarely it's cleared." The mare shifted under her, restless with the stillness. Serafina brought her back with a small adjustment of weight that required no visible effort. "I'll consider the invitation," she said. "That's all I'm asking." He inclined his head, not the formal bow of court protocol, something shorter and more personal. "Enjoy the rest of your morning, Lady Vale." He rode on. She watched him go, and then turned the mare back toward the eastern path, and rode through the cool morning with something that was not quite thoughtlessness and not quite plan, but somewhere in that productive space between the two, where things that would eventually become decisions were still assembling themselves. The invitation arrived the following Tuesday. Formal, on heavy paper bearing the royal household's private seal. Not the official crest of state functions, but the smaller, simpler mark used for personal correspondence. The working group met twice a month on Thursday evenings at a house on Aldrich Crescent that the Crown used for informal engagements. Attendance was optional, the letter said, which Serafina understood to mean it was expected, which he further understood to mean that the Crown Prince was not in the habit of issuing invitations he thought would be declined. She sent her acceptance. The working group turned out to be 7 people. A constitutional scholar named Dr. Ravenswood, who had more energy in his arguments than most men half his age. A woman, Lady Isolde Marchmont, who had been managing her husband's shipping concerns for 12 years since his death, and knew the eastern trade routes at the operational level that academic analysis consistently missed. A former diplomat named Hargrove, who had served in the Valdenmoor legation before his retirement, which meant he was useful and also, Serafina noted with internal precision, currently in the room. And Lucien, who ran the meetings with an efficiency that suggested he found long discussions of procedure as tedious as she did. He asked good questions. That was the first thing she noticed, properly noticed, in the context of watching him work. Not performing question asking, not using questions to make points he'd already decided on, but actual questions. The kind that revealed the shape of his own uncertainty and invited someone else to fill it in. It was, she thought, an unusual quality in a man of his position. She contributed carefully at first, testing the register of the room, the tolerance for directness, the specific hierarchy of expertise that had established itself before her arrival. By the third meeting, she was arguing with Dr. Ravenswood about the historical precedents for trade restructuring with enough force that two of the other members had gone quiet and were watching with the expression of people who had front-row seats to something unexpected. After that meeting, as the group dispersed and the attendants began returning the room to its ordinary configuration, Lucien came to stand beside her at the window where she'd retreated with the last of her tea. Ravenswood will spend the entire next 2 weeks reconsidering his position, he said. I can already tell. His position has a flaw in the primary assumption, she said. It's cleanest to identify it early. I agree completely. He looked out at the dark street below. I'm glad you came to the park that morning. She looked at him sideways. You were already there. I don't think I can take credit for the venue. You could have kept writing, he said. Most people would have. The Crown Prince is not an easy person to have an accidental conversation with. I found it manageable, she said. Something in his expression shifted. Not amusement exactly, but something adjacent to it, something warm and understated. That's possibly the most diplomatic description of me I've heard in recent memory. She almost said something then, almost said, you're easier than most people think you are. But it was too early for that kind of directness, and she was still calibrating, still understanding what this was and what it wasn't and what it might eventually become. Good night, Your Royal Highness, she said instead. Good night, Lady Vale. She walked home through the cool autumn evening and thought about trade routes and the gap in Dr. Ravenswood's primary assumption and the specific quality of stillness that some people were simply born carrying. She did not think about Adrian, or she tried not to, which was different, but was at least a kind of direction. The letter from Adrian arrived on a Wednesday evening in the 4th week after the Gazette announcement. She recognized his handwriting on the envelope before she turned it over. 7 years of reading his correspondence, notes passed across card tables, letters sent during the season he'd spent in the Northern Territories overseeing his estate's winter affairs, the brief formal acknowledgments that had carried their own specific language beneath the official language. She knew the particular elongation of his capital letters, the way he pressed harder on downstrokes when the content cost him something to write. This one pressed hard on the downstrokes. She set it on her writing desk and did not open it that evening. She opened it the next morning over coffee in the clear light of day, because if she was going to let his handwriting into her mind, she would do it when she was clear-headed and caffeinated and capable of receiving it with appropriate distance. He had written, I need to speak with you, not in a social setting, properly. I know I've forfeited the right to ask this. I'm asking anyway. There are things I should have said before the announcement that I did not say, and I find that their weight is not diminishing with time. Name a time and place. I will be there. She read it twice. The letter had the quality of something that had cost him. She could see it in the compressed syntax, the uncharacteristic directness. Adrian was not a man who exposed his unfinished thinking to other people. He processed internally and presented conclusions. This letter was not a conclusion. This was raw material. She thought about it for 3 days. She thought about it during the Thursday working group meeting, where Hargrove made an observation about Valdenmoor's debt architecture that intersected precisely with the instability she'd heard about through her mother's old contacts. And she watched Lucien's face process that information with the particular economy of a man storing it immediately for future use. And she thought, 2 months ago, I would have taken this intelligence to Adrian. She no longer needed an intermediary for that. She wrote back to Adrian on the 4th day, 7 o'clock Friday evening. My study. You have 20 minutes. She sent the reply and then went to meet with Lady Forthright about the Education Trust, and spent 2 hours discussing the precise mechanics of how to fund 17 additional scholarships without creating the kind of precedent that would generate political complications. And when she came home, she felt useful in a way that had nothing to do with anyone else's trajectory. Friday arrived. He came at precisely 7, which meant he'd probably been outside for several minutes beforehand, because Adrian was constitutionally early and had trained himself over years of political meetings to arrive at the stated time rather than the time that revealed he'd been anxious. She knew this because she had learned all his adaptations, the way you learned the particular grammar of a language you'd spent years immersed in. The footman showed him to the study, and she poured nothing for either of them and gestured to the chair across from her writing desk, because she was not going to have this conversation in a seating arrangement that implied comfort. He sat. He looked at her. The overhead light was direct and a little cold, and it showed everything the evening at the Hartwell reception had softened, the specific quality of the tiredness, which had not diminished in 4 weeks. "Thank you for seeing me," he said. "You have 20 minutes, she said. "Use them." He was quiet for a moment, not the quiet of gathering an argument, the quiet of someone confronting the distance between what they'd planned to say and what the room was actually requiring. "I chose this engagement," he said, "for reasons that I could explain to you in terms that would sound rational, and they would be rational, technically. Valdenmoor represents a significant alignment at a critical moment in the Eastern border negotiations, and Isidore's family has connections to the Reform Caucus in the Eastern Senate that would take me a decade to build independently, and if I'm going to have any real influence over what happens in the next legislative cycle, I needed." He stopped. "None of that is what I came to say." "Then say what you came to say," she said. "I knew what I was doing," he said, "when I made the decision. I knew exactly what I was setting aside, and I told myself that it was the necessary calculation, and I told myself that you were—" Another stop. "I told myself that you were capable of handling it, which is true, which is also one of the coldest things I have ever thought about another person." The room was very quiet. "I don't want your apology," she said. "I know. I don't want your accounting of your reasoning. I know that too." He leaned forward slightly. "What I want, what I came here to ask, is whether there is any version of this in which we don't lose each other entirely. Not romantically, not the way things were. I understand that's gone. But," he seemed to reach for something and not quite find it. "I understand what you are, what you're actually capable of, and I think I have spent 7 years benefiting from that without ever making it visible to you, and I don't know how to—" "Stop," she said. He stopped. "You want to renegotiate the terms," she said, "now that the original contract has expired. You want to see if something salvageable remains." "Yes," he said after a moment. "That's exactly what I want." She looked at him. 7 years of fluency in that face, and she could read it clearly in this light, could see the specific combination of calculation and something rawer behind it, the thing he wouldn't name because naming it would cost him the last bit of advantage he was trying to retain in this conversation. She had an answer. She knew the answer, but before she could deliver it, her footman appeared at the door, and his expression was the specific expression of a footman who had been instructed to interrupt only in extraordinary circumstances, which meant this was extraordinary. "My lady," he said, "I apologize. There is a man at the rear entrance. He's asking for you by name specifically, and he says—" The footman paused. "He says to tell you that the Thornfield matter has begun. He said you would understand." Serafina went very still. The Thornfield matter. It was a name she'd last heard spoken 8 months ago, in a conversation she'd thought was hypothetical. A name attached to something she'd been gathering quietly for months. Evidence of a coordinated effort at the highest levels of the kingdom's political structure to undermine the line of royal succession, evidence she had brought to exactly 2 people, neither of whom was currently in this room. The evidence that, in the hands of the wrong people, could destabilize everything. She stood up. "You need to leave," she said to Adrian. "Serafina." "Now," she said, and the word came out with a quality she rarely allowed herself to use. The quality that said, "This is not a request, this is not part of a conversation, this is a door, and it is closing. Through the front, don't speak to anyone." He stood, reading her face with the fluency she'd given him. What's happening? She was already moving to the door. Go home, Adrian. Don't speak to anyone about having been here. She went to the rear entrance, and the man waiting for her in the cold service corridor, with rain on his coat and fear in his eyes, handed her a document that made her stomach drop with the clean, sickening clarity of a stone hitting water. It was her own handwriting, her notes, her evidence, the exact record of what she'd discovered and when and who she'd told. And at the bottom, in red ink, in a hand she did not recognize, we know what you have. Come forward with it, and we will ensure the Crown Prince's name appears in every document you've been protecting him from. Destroy it, and you're safe. You have 3 days. She stood in the cold corridor and held the document and looked at the man who had delivered it, and she thought, someone inside the trust has turned. And she thought, whoever sent this doesn't yet understand the specific nature of the woman they've just threatened. She folded the document. Thank you, she said very calmly to the terrified man in front of her. And then she went back inside to figure out exactly how she was going to burn them all down. The man's name was Perrin. He was a clerk, had been a clerk, past tense now in the way that mattered, in the office of Lord Chamberlain Westcott, which was how he had access to the kind of documents that should have been beyond a clerk's reach, and which was also, Serafina understood within 30 seconds of looking at his face, precisely why someone had used him to deliver this particular message rather than sending anyone of consequence. Perrin was expendable. The message was the point. Perrin was just the paper it arrived on. How long have you known about what I was gathering? She asked him. He was shaking, not the theatrical shaking of someone performing fear, the specific fine tremor of a person whose body had been running on adrenaline for hours and had now arrived somewhere warm and still and had started the process of accounting for it. 3 weeks, he said. Maybe 4. They didn't tell me everything. They told me what to carry. Who gave you the document? A man I don't know. Outside Westcott's building, Tuesday morning. He knew my name. He knew... Perrin stopped, swallowed. He knew about my brother's debts. He said if I brought this to you tonight, the debts would be handled. If I didn't... You don't need to finish that, she said. I understand the structure. She did understand it. The structure was clean, actually, in a ruthless way. Find the person with the most accessible vulnerability, apply the appropriate pressure, use them as the delivery mechanism, and insulate everyone who mattered behind layers of deniability. Whoever had sent this had done it before. This was not improvised. She looked at Perrin. He was 23, maybe 24. The kind of young that still believed the systems around him were more stable than they were. Go home, she said. Don't speak to anyone about tonight. Not your brother, not your landlady, no one. If anyone asks where you were, you spent the evening at the Anchor on Fitch Street. What are you going to... Go home, Perrin. He went. She stood in the corridor alone for exactly 60 seconds. She gave herself that. 60 seconds to feel the specific gravity of what she was holding, the weight of it, the way it altered the geometry of everything she'd been building over the past 4 weeks. Then she moved. The document went into the false bottom of the walnut writing box her mother had left her. The box sat on the second shelf of the library behind a complete set of Alden-Morian agricultural surveys from 1847, which no one had opened since approximately 1849. The evidence she'd been accumulating, the real evidence, the months of careful collection, was not in the house. It had never been in the house. She wasn't a fool. But whoever had sent that message didn't know that, which meant they thought they were threatening someone who kept their most critical material within reach, which told her something specific about how they'd assessed her. They thought she was careful, but not careful enough. They thought she was smart, but not strategic. They had looked at a woman who had spent 7 years in the shadow of someone else's ambitions and concluded that she was fundamentally reactive rather than prepared. That was going to be a significant error on their part. She sat at the writing desk, lit a second lamp, took a piece of paper from the drawer and wrote 5 names, not in order of likelihood, not in order of proximity to the conspiracy she'd been tracking, but in order of what she could reach within the next 24 hours without raising flags. She studied the list, added a 6th name, crossed out the 4th. Then she wrote a single line at the bottom of the page. 3 days is not a gift. It's a window they intend to close. She burned the paper in the fireplace. She slept 4 hours. Not the sleep of someone untroubled, the sleep of someone who had made enough decisions to rest and was saving the rest of the thinking for morning, which was when the thinking was cleanest, as she had told the Crown Prince on that morning in the park, which felt now like something from a different chapter of her life. At 5:30 she dressed. At 6 she was in a hackney cab heading north. The house on Verinder Lane was narrow and unremarkable, wedged between a tailor's shop and a building that had been a bookbinder's before it became something less clearly defined. Mrs. Adeline Crowe had lived there for 11 years, since her retirement from a position as personal secretary to a succession of politically significant men, a position that had made her intimately acquainted with the infrastructure of consequence in Aldenmoor's governmental class. Adeline was 61 and had the compact, deliberate quality of someone who had long ago decided that everything she did would be exactly as necessary as it needed to be, and nothing more. She opened the door before Serafina knocked. "I heard the cab," she said. "Come in. There's coffee." They sat in the narrow kitchen. Adeline poured. She didn't ask why Serafina was there at 6 in the morning because she had known Serafina since Serafina was 11 years old, and she understood that early morning arrivals from this particular woman meant something had shifted. Serafina told her about the document, about Perrin, about the 3 days. Adeline listened without interrupting, which was one of her most useful qualities, and then she was quiet for a moment that lasted exactly as long as she needed it to. "Westcott," she said. The clerk was Westcott's. The message was designed to look like it came from outside the Chamberlain's office, but the pressure mechanism, the brothers' debts, that kind of specific personal leverage on a low-level clerk doesn't come from someone operating outside the official records. Someone looked at Perrin's file. Westcott has access to every file in the Chamberlain's domain. Yes. But Westcott isn't doing this alone. No. Serafina set down her coffee cup. Which is what the Thornfield matter was always about. The Chamberlain as the coordination point, not the origin. Adeline looked at her steadily. "You've been pointing at the Duke of Thornfield for 4 months. The evidence points at him. I've been following the evidence. The Duke of Thornfield has been a fixture of the royal court for 30 years. He was advisor to the king's father. He has more embedded relationships in this government than almost anyone alive." "I know. And you've been building a case against him." Adeline's voice held no judgment, just the precise, careful quality of someone laying out the dimensions of a problem. "And now someone connected to that case has sent you a message telling you that if you bring what you know forward, they'll attach the Crown Prince's name to it." "Yes? Can they actually do that? Is there a real thread connecting Lucien to any of this?" Serafina had been turning this over since midnight. "There's a thread that could be made to look real," she said. "Lucien's working group on the Eastern trade architecture. 2 of the policy positions we've developed intersect with areas where Thornfield has been making moves. If someone wanted to construct a narrative where the Crown Prince was complicit rather than investigating, the raw material exists. Then they've been watching the working group." "They've been watching everything," she said. "That's what the message tells me. Not that they're powerful, that they've been watching everything and they want me to know it." Adeline was quiet again. Then, "What do you need from me?" "Westcott's schedule for the next 2 weeks, and whatever you still have from your time with Lord Ashmore's office. Specifically anything touching the Thornfield family's parliamentary activity in the past 5 years. Adeline nodded once. "The schedule I can get by this afternoon. The Ashmore material is in storage. I'll need until tomorrow morning." "That's sufficient?" Serafina stood. "And Adeline?" She looked at the older woman. "If anyone asks, I wasn't here." "You're never here," Adeline said, as she had been saying for the better part of 15 years. Bucket. She went directly from Verinder Lane to Aldrich Crescent. She had not told Lucien she was coming. Protocol said she should have sent a message 24 hours in advance, which protocol said because the Crown Prince's schedule was managed by people whose entire function was to prevent unstructured access to him, which was precisely why she hadn't done it. Unstructured access was what this required. The attendant at the door of the Crescent House knew her from the working group meetings. He was to his credit professionally impassive about the fact that she was arriving at 7:45 in the morning without an appointment. "I need 5 minutes with His Royal Highness," she said. "Tell him it's Lady Vale and that it concerns the Thornfield matter." The attendant's impassivity held exactly long enough for her to see that the name landed. Then he said, "One moment," and disappeared inside. She waited in the entrance hall. A clock on the mantel said 7:48. She cataloged the room as she always did when she had a moment of stillness. The arrangement of furniture, what it told you about how the space was actually used versus how it was officially organized, where the light fell. It was a habit she'd developed long before she'd understood why it was useful, this compulsive reading of environment. You understood people through their spaces the same way you understood them through their hands. Lucien came through the interior door in 2 minutes, not 5. He was dressed for the day but had not yet received visitors. His expression had the quality of someone who had been in the middle of something internal when interrupted. He took one look at her face and said to the attendant without turning, "We're not to be disturbed." They went into the small study off the entrance hall. He closed the door. "Tell me," he said. She told him. She did it the same way she'd told Adeline, efficiently, without preamble, the facts in the order they needed to be received. She watched him receive them. Watched his face go through something that wasn't quite fear. Fear wasn't quite the right word for what moved through Lucien when confronted with significant threat. It was more like the face of someone reconfiguring, taking in new information and rapidly, visibly restructuring everything they knew around it. "My name," he said when she'd finished. "Specifically, they named you specifically in the threat, which means they've been monitoring the working group." "That's what I believe." He was quiet for a moment. He moved to the window, not restlessly, deliberately, the way he moved to spaces where he could think without the room pressing on him. "How long have you known about Thornfield?" "Concretely 4 months. The earlier threads, longer." He turned. "You didn't bring this to me before now." "I didn't have sufficient evidence to present to you before now. What I had was directional. What I'm building is a case, and a case without adequate evidence isn't protection. It's exposure." He studied her for a moment with those amber-green eyes that people described in overwrought terms in the social pages, and she held the eye contact because she was not going to look away from this conversation. "You were protecting me," he said. Not accusatory, not surprised. Just the specific quality of a man who has identified a thing clearly and is naming it. "I was building a case," she repeated. "You were also protecting me." She didn't confirm it. She didn't deny it. "The more pressing question," she said, "is what this message tells us about their timeline." The question redirected him, which was what she'd intended. He turned back to the window. 3 days is not the actual deadline." "No, 3 days is when they expect me to make a visible move, either to come forward, which triggers their defensive action, or to destroy the evidence, which is what they actually want. What they're trying to avoid is silence. Because silence means you're doing something they can't predict." "Yes." He was quiet for a long moment. She could hear the clock from the entrance hall through the closed door, the steady pulse of it in the silence. "What do you need from me?" he said. It was the same question Adeline had asked, using approximately the same inflection. The specific register of someone removing their own preferences from the equation and putting themselves in service of what was actually required. She had not expected it to feel the way it felt, hearing that question for the second time in one morning. The first time it had felt like resource access, which it was. This time it felt like something she didn't have an adequate word for, something that sat at the intersection of trust and relief and the particular quality of being looked at directly by someone who wasn't managing what they saw. "Access to whatever Lord Chamberlain Westcott has presented to you in the last 3 months," she said. "Official briefings, informal communications, any documentation that passed through his office to yours. I need to understand what they think you know versus what you actually know. That I can provide." He paused. "And the evidence you've been building, where is it?" "Safe," she said. "Not here and not at my house. It doesn't need to be here for what comes next." "What does come next?" She looked at him. "They've given me 3 days," she said. "I intend to use all of them. What I'll do with the end of the third one will depend on what I find between now and then." He held her gaze for a long moment. "You came here this morning," he said, "before anyone else. Before Adrian." The way he said it wasn't possessive. It was an observation, the kind of observation that meant he'd already understood something about the shape of things and was choosing to name it quietly rather than leaving it unnamed in the space between them. She didn't look away. "You needed to know immediately," she said, and you weren't going to make it difficult. And Adrian would have? Adrian, she said, would have wanted to be useful in the way that would give him the most information about what I was doing. That's not criticism. It's simply not what this morning required. Lucien held her gaze inside it. Something shifted in his expression. Not warmth exactly, not yet, but the specific quality of a man who has looked at a woman clearly and understood that she has looked back at him with the same precision and has chosen, with full information, to be here. Serafina, he said. It was the first time he'd used her name without the title. She felt it. She didn't let herself feel it fully. Not here, not now. But she felt the edge of it. The third day, she said steadily. I'll have enough by then to bring this to the council, but I need to know that when I do, you'll stand behind it without conditions. I've never put conditions on the truth, he said. Good, she said, because what I'm going to show them is going to make a great many powerful people extremely uncomfortable, and comfortable men don't acquit themselves well under that kind of pressure. She turned to leave. His voice caught her at the door. Be careful, he said. She paused. She did not turn back around because if she had, she would have been seen with whatever was in her face just then, and it was too early for that. I'm always careful, she said to the door. I know, he said. That's why I'm asking you to be something more than careful. She walked out into the morning. The sun had climbed. Aldrich Crescent held its usual composition of early traffic and unhurried pigeons, and the particular quality of light that hit white stonework at this hour and turned it into something almost warm. She walked 3 blocks before she let herself think about the way he had said her name. Then she stopped thinking about it and went to work. Tuck. The second day passed in a state of controlled excavation. She moved through the city methodically. Adeline in the morning with the Ashmore files, which contained exactly what she'd suspected and which fit against what she already had with the sickening precision of 2 pieces of a broken plate rejoining. A former parliamentary recorder named Gethwick in the afternoon, who had served during a pivotal session 8 years ago when Thornfield had maneuvered a specific succession amendment through a committee that should never have passed it. Gethwick was elderly and careful and had never spoken to anyone about what he remembered, but he spoke to her eventually because she asked the right questions and waited with the patience of someone who had learned that people needed to arrive at their own willingness. By the time she reached home on the evening of the second day, she had something that was no longer merely directional. It was a case. Not complete, not the kind of thing that would survive the pressure of a full royal council without additional support, but the architecture was there, and the architecture was solid. She sat with it in her study. The fire had burned down to low coals. Outside, the street was quiet in the specific way of late-evening Alden Moor. Carriages thinning, gas lamps holding their steady geometry, the occasional sound of footsteps on stone. She heard the knock at precisely 9. Not the front door. The side entrance, off the garden. The knock that wasn't a servant's knock. She was very still for a moment. Then she went to the door and opened it. Adrian stood in the garden entrance, without his usual attendants, with rain on his coat that told her it had started again while she wasn't paying attention to the sky. I told you not to come back here, she said. I know. He looked at her. His face in the garden light was harder to read than it had been in the study 2 nights ago. The specific quality of someone who had made a decision he knew was going to cost him and had arrived at the cost with a kind of terrible clarity. I went home after Friday. I did what you asked. I didn't speak to anyone. He paused. And then I found out this morning that Dobbins, my secretary, Dobbins, has been in communication with Westcott's office for the past 6 weeks. The ground shifted under the evening. Dobbins, she said. 6 weeks. I found a letter in his desk that I had no business finding, and I found it because he made one mistake in the past 6 weeks of apparently careful work, and the mistake was leaving it in a place I happened to look. His voice had the flat, controlled quality of a man who had been angry for approximately 12 hours and had processed most of it into something more functional. He's been passing information about my schedule, my meetings, my communications, to Westcott's office. What kind of information? Enough. He looked at her. Serafina, I know I'm the last person you want standing in your garden. I know I've forfeited most of what would make you want to listen to me, but I need you to tell me how deep this goes. Because if my own secretary has been feeding my movements to whoever is running Westcott, then I've been walking blind into something for 6 weeks. And whatever you have, he stopped, his jaw tightened. Whatever you have, I need to know if I'm already part of it. She looked at him. This man she had spent 7 years learning. This man whose hand she could read, and whose adapted behaviors she could catalog, and whose decision to trade her for a foreign title had compressed 7 years of investment into a single cold morning with the Gazette. He was afraid. She could see it clearly. Not performing vulnerability, actually afraid, which was different and rarer, and which she acknowledged to herself without letting it change the geometry of the question she was trying to answer. She said very carefully, "Do you understand that whatever I tell you stays here?" "Yes." "Do you understand that if you take what I tell you to anyone, Dobbins is obviously gone, but anyone else in your household, anyone in your social circle, any contact you have with the Chamberlain's office in any form, that you will not only compromise what I've been building, but potentially put the Crown Prince in direct danger?" Something shifted in his face at the Crown Prince's name. She watched it shift and noted it and filed it away. "I understand," he said. "Then come inside," she said. "You have 10 minutes." He came through the door. She was already moving toward the study, her mind running the calculation, how much to tell him, what the specific value was of him knowing versus not knowing, whether she could trust what he told her about Dobbins, or whether the Dobbins story was itself engineered, which was not impossible, and which she would not rule out simply because he looked genuinely frightened. She turned to face him in the study doorway, and the window behind her exploded inward. Not an accident, not the wind. The specific, deliberate impact of something thrown hard against glass, and in the moment of shattering she was already moving, body-level response, the kind that bypassed thought entirely. And Adrian was reaching for her arm and pulling her away from the glass and toward the interior wall, and in the rain-cold air coming through the shattered window, she heard footsteps, heavy, fast, on the gravel of the garden path. Multiple footsteps. She looked at Adrian. His face was 4 inches from hers, and the fear in it had reorganized into something else entirely. Something harder, more present, the face of a man whose body had made the same decision hers had, and was ready to act on it. "Side door," she said, her voice barely above a breath. "Lock it, now." He went. She went in the opposite direction, toward the desk, toward the drawer, toward the one thing she had kept close after all. Not the documents, but the small, flat-bladed letter knife that was not precisely a weapon, but would do what it needed to do if it needed to do something. The side door to the garden rattled. Once, hard, then stopped. Silence. She stood in the middle of the study with the knife in her hand, and the cold air coming through the broken window, and the fire down to coals, and the full, nauseating understanding arriving all at once. The 3 days had just ended early, and whoever was outside that door had come because they already knew she wasn't going to destroy the evidence, which meant they'd decided to destroy her instead. The silence after the rattling lasted 4 seconds. Serafina counted them. 4 seconds was long enough to understand that whatever was outside had stopped moving, which was worse than if it had kept moving, because things that stopped moving were things that were listening. Things that were listening were things that knew how to be patient, which meant they had done this before, which meant she was not dealing with someone improvising under pressure. She was dealing with professionals. Adrian came back from the side door. His face had the color of a man who had received a significant physical shock and was metabolizing it through sheer force of will. He looked at the knife in her hand and said nothing about it. "How many?" he said. "I counted 2 sets of footsteps. Could be 3. The front of the house. My footman sleeps in the east room. He won't have heard the window." She was already moving, already doing the mathematics. The house had 3 exits she would use and 2 she wouldn't. The garden wall was 6 feet, and she knew every handhold in it from years of childhood experiments. The alley behind the wall opened onto Creswick Lane, which connected to the main thoroughfare in under a minute at a walking pace and under 30 seconds if she ran. "Serafina," Adrian's voice. Low, controlled, with the specific register of a man who has information he knows he shouldn't have held until this moment. "There's something I didn't tell you." She stopped. The fire threw the last of its heat into the room. Through the broken window, cold air moved steadily, carrying the smell of rain and wet stone. "Tell me now," she said. Dobbins. He looked at her. When I found the letter in his desk this morning, there were 2 letters. I told you about the one communicating with Westcott's office. He paused. 1 beat, 2. The second one was addressed to you. The room reorganized itself around that sentence. What did it say? She said. Not a question, the flattest possible version of the words. It was instructions. For what to tell you when I came here tonight. The story about finding the letters. About Dobbins communicating with Westcott. It's real. All of it is real. But the way I found out wasn't an accident. He held her gaze with the specific quality of a man who has decided to stop managing his own appearance in a conversation and is simply standing in what he's done. Someone sent me a message 2 days ago telling me that if I came to you tonight with the Dobbins information, and if you let me in, I should keep you here long enough for them to arrive, she said. Yes. The word landed with the weight of everything she hadn't wanted to be true. She looked at him. This man she had spent 7 years learning. This man whose fear she had catalogued as real 20 minutes ago, standing in the garden entrance with rain on his coat. The fear had been real. She still believed that. People could be genuinely afraid of consequences they had nonetheless set in motion. That was not a contradiction. That was simply the specific texture of a certain kind of betrayal. The kind committed by people who believed they could manage the damage, who had not fully anticipated the precise weight of what they were putting in motion until they were standing inside it. Did you know they were going to send people here tonight? She said. I thought... He stopped. His jaw worked. I thought the letter meant they were going to send someone to watch, to confirm that you didn't run. I didn't think they were going to... You didn't think, she said. Very quiet. Very even. No, you didn't think. That's the precise and complete truth of it. She turned away from him. Not in anger. Anger was a temperature she couldn't afford right now. She turned away because she needed to stop looking at his face, which was the face of a man being consumed by the specific understanding that he had just done something irreversible, and looking at it was costing her processing capacity she needed for other things. The side door rattled again. Harder this time. She moved. Scent. The east corridor was dark. She moved through it from memory. 14 steps, turn left, 6 more, the narrow servant's stair. Adrian followed close enough that she could hear his breathing, but controlled enough not to crowd her, which she registered with a distant, clinical gratitude. The walnut box in my library, she said under her breath as they climbed. Second shelf, behind the agricultural surveys. The evidence? A document. Not the evidence, a document. If anything happens to me before morning, it goes to Lucian, not through official channels, directly. You find a way to put it in his hands, and his hands only. Adrian grabbed her arm in the dark of the stairwell. His grip was tight. Nothing is going to happen to you. Let go of my arm, she said. He let go. They came out on the second-floor landing. The window at the end of the corridor looked down into the front street. She crossed to it and looked out. A carriage. Stopped, dark. No livery she could identify. One figure on the street, positioned with the deliberate casualness of someone who had been instructed to look like they were not waiting. Front exit, then, was closed. Garden wall, she said. The ivy section on the east face. There are holds at the third stone from the left at the base, again at chest height, and at the top. Can you clear a 6-foot wall? Yes. Then follow me down. Don't speak until we're on the other side. She had her hand on the door at the end of the corridor when she heard it. Not from outside. From inside the house. From below. The specific sound of the study door, which she knew every sound this house made, had catalogued them the way she catalogued everything, being opened from the inside. She went absolutely still. From below, footsteps. Measured. Unhurried. The footsteps of someone who had already cleared the room they were entering and was moving through familiar territory. The side door. They had come through the side door she had told Adrian to lock, which Adrian had gone to lock, and which had still rattled a second time, which meant it had not been fully latched, which meant he had not completed the lock before coming back to tell her about Dobbins. One mistake. One 30-second gap between decision and execution. That was all it had taken. She turned back from the corridor door, looked at Adrian. His face in the dark said he'd heard it too, and what was in his face now was past the managed zone entirely. It was the raw face of a man who understood that he had made an error with a specific and immediate human cost, and was confronting that understanding in real time. She pointed up. The attic stair. They went. Bah. The attic was cold and smelled of old wood and years. Serafina moved through it without a lamp, navigating by the thin gray light that came through the single ventilation panel in the east face. Boxes, trunks, the particular graveyard of objects that accumulated in a family house across generations. Her mother's writing table with the broken leg, hat boxes from a fashion era 20 years past. Her father's hunting equipment still oiled and strapped and pointing at a future that had not arrived. She went to the ventilation panel. It was hinged. She had known that since she was 11. Below, the footsteps had reached the first-floor landing. She unlatched the panel. Cold air hit her face. Below the panel, the roof of the garden conservatory. Sloped, glass-paned, too fragile to support weight directly, but with a stone gutter rail along the outer edge that was structurally sound. She had tested it once, at 12, for reasons she had not adequately explained to her mother afterward. The gutter rail, she said. Step on the frame, not the glass. The rail connects to the east wall of the conservatory, which gives you the wall itself, which is stone and solid. From the wall to the garden, from the garden to the east face, the same ivy route I described. Adrian looked at the opening, looked at her. You go first. I go second. Move. He went through the panel with the particular gracelessness of a large man navigating an opening designed for someone considerably smaller, and for one nauseating moment she thought the glass was going to go anyway. But he found the rail and the weight distributed and held, and then she was through and behind him and pulling the panel closed. The cold was complete out here, rain smell and the sound of the city at a distance, and below them the garden dark and quiet. They moved along the gutter rail. She was more methodical than Adrian, placing each step with the patience she had learned at 12 when there had been no particular consequence, and was applying now when there was every possible consequence. The rain had made the stones slick. She compensated by slowing further and gripping harder and not looking at the drop. They reached the east wall. She went up the ivy first, the hold she knew, third stone, chest height, the top, and came over onto the garden path in the dark, and turned and watched Adrian's hands find each hold without instruction and pull himself up with more competence than the study had made her expect. He came over the wall. They were in the alley. She ran. He ran beside her. Neither of them spoke. Creswick Lane appeared in 30 seconds, the thoroughfare in 30 more, and she moved into the flow of late evening foot traffic and slowed immediately to a walk, pulling him with her, because running on a main street was visible, and visible was finished. They walked for 2 blocks. Then she turned into a doorway. A printer's shop, closed, the doorway deep enough to hold them both. And stopped. She breathed. One full breath, controlled, from the bottom of the lungs. Let herself feel the shaking in her hands, and then moved it somewhere internal and closed a door on it. We have perhaps an hour, she said, before they've confirmed we're not in the house and have started looking at the surrounding area. Your carriage cannot come to any address I'm going to tell you. Do you understand that? Yes. Is there anyone in your household staff whose loyalty you would stake your life on tonight? Not historically. Tonight, given what you now know about Dobbins. He thought for exactly 3 seconds. Harrow. My head groom. He's been with my family since before I was born, and he has no connection to my social or political life. Can you reach him without going through anyone else in the household? Yes. He lives above the stables. Separate entrance. Then here's what you're going to do, she said. She gave him the address. Not Adeline's, not anywhere she'd been in the past 48 hours. A house on Fenwick Street that belonged to a woman named Mrs. Carver, who had been her mother's oldest friend, and who had never, in 60 years of living in the city, been connected to anyone of political significance. You go to Harrow. You come to Fenwick Street with nothing official, nothing that carries your name. You knock twice, pause, once. If Mrs. Carver answers, say you're there for the Whitmore collection. She'll let you in. And you? I have somewhere to be first. Serafina, I am not having this conversation in a doorway, she said. Go. She looked at him. He looked back at her, and in the thin light falling from the street, she could see the specific quality of what was in his face. Not guilt exactly, past guilt now, something that had been refined by the last 90 minutes into a harder material. The face of a man who had arrived at the precise center of the worst choice he'd ever made and was standing in it without any remaining capacity for self-deception. "I know what I did tonight," he said. "Yes," she said, "you do." She left the doorway and walked north. It took her 22 minutes to reach Adeline's house on Verinder Lane, moving in a route that added 8 unnecessary minutes but crossed no street she had used in the past 3 days. She knocked. Adeline opened the door with the expression of someone who had not been asleep, which told her something. "How long ago did you know?" Serafina said, stepping inside. Adeline was quiet for a moment, 1 moment exactly. "Sit down." "How long?" "This afternoon." Adeline moved toward the kitchen with the deliberate pace of someone who had decided that a conversation of this weight required heat and proper lighting. "A man came to the back entrance. He had a message he said was intended for you, to be delivered through me. He knew I was connected to you, which tells me someone has been watching your connections for considerably longer than 3 days." "What was the message?" Adeline set the kettle on, turned. That the Thornfield evidence had already been copied. That whatever you had, they had a version of. That bringing it to the council would accomplish nothing because the copies would surface simultaneously and discredit both the evidence and you with it. The room was warm and small, and the kettle was ticking against the silence. "You didn't tell me this afternoon," Serafina said. "I needed to confirm it first. I didn't want to bring you a message that might itself be a maneuver to panic you into a premature move." Adeline looked at her steadily. "I confirmed it 2 hours ago. A contact in Westcott's archive office. The copies are real." Serafina sat, not because she needed to, because the standing was suddenly costing more than it was worth. She thought about 4 months. 4 months of careful, methodical accumulation, every document verified, every source confirmed, every chain of custody protected. She had been meticulous. She was always meticulous. And somewhere in the meticulousness, somewhere in the distance between what she had protected and what she hadn't known to protect, there had been a gap. 4 months of work. "The Ashmore files you pulled for me yesterday morning," she said. "Who else knew you were pulling them?" Adeline was quiet. "Adeline." "My contact in the storage archive," Adeline said, "who I have used without incident for 11 years, who I did not think to consider because 11 years is a long time to trust someone." She paused. "I am sorry, Serafina." Serafina looked at her. This woman who had known her since she was 11 years old, who had opened doors at 6 in the morning without complaint and sourced documents and kept silences across 15 years of navigating a world that consistently underestimated them both. "Don't," she said. "Don't apologize. It was my error too. I told you what I needed without thinking through every access point." The kettle began its low sound. Adeline poured. They sat across the narrow kitchen table. Serafina held the cup, felt the heat move through her palms. "The council presentation," she said. "Everything I had built toward that, the structure, the evidence chain, the order in which it needed to land to be uncontestable, it relied on the authenticity being unimpeachable. If there are copies that can be altered and surfaced simultaneously, it becomes a dispute about documentation," Adeline said, "not a presentation of fact." "Yes." She stared at the table. "And a documentation dispute at the level of the Royal Council, with the Duke of Thornfield on one side and a woman with no official standing on the other, resolves in one direction." She thought about Lucian, about amber-green eyes in the morning light of a study on Aldrich Crescent, about the way he'd said her name for the first time without the title, the specific quality of the moment, what it had felt like to be seen that clearly by someone who had no obligation to see her at all. If this fell apart, if the evidence became contested, if Thornfield's people managed to attach his name to it, she would not simply lose the case. She would be the instrument of his destruction. The woman who had brought him something unverifiable and put him in front of it. She would not let that happen. The thought arrived with a clarity that was almost physical, not a decision so much as a recognition, the way you recognized a door you hadn't known was there until it was suddenly the only door in the room. She set down the cup. "What do you know about Lord Westcott's private schedule?" she said. Not the official one, the actual one. Adeline looked at her with the expression of someone recalibrating. I know he has a standing arrangement every Thursday at a house on Mercer Street that doesn't appear in any official documentation. Thursday, Serafina said. That's tomorrow night. Yes. Who else attends these arrangements? I don't know. My information goes only as far as the address and the regularity. Serafina was quiet for a moment. She was doing something she had never done before in 4 months of building this case. She was departing from the plan. The plan had been evidence, verification, counsel. Clean, legal, unimpeachable. The plan had relied on a world in which her evidence was the only version. That world no longer existed. What existed now was a Thursday evening arrangement on Mercer Street, and a woman who had spent 7 years learning to read rooms and people and the precise space between what was being said and what was true, and 36 hours before whatever Thornfield intended to do next. The plan was gone. What was left was something harder and less certain, and entirely without the comfort of procedure. She thought about her mother, who had taken up very little space. I need to know everything you know about that address, she said. And then I need to borrow a coat that isn't mine. Adeline looked at her for a long moment. You understand what you're describing? I understand that building a careful case was the right approach until someone made it the wrong approach. She held the older woman's gaze. I've spent 4 months being methodical. I've spent 4 months inside a structure someone else designed and anticipated and prepared a response to. The methodology was correct and it's still lost. So what are you proposing? Something they haven't prepared a response to, she said. Because you can't prepare a response to something you don't believe a woman like me is capable of doing. The kitchen was warm and close, and the rain had started again against the single window. Adeline studied her with the specific quality of someone reassessing a thing they thought they already understood. Then she stood and moved toward the back room where the coats were kept, and said, over her shoulder, words that landed in the quiet like a key turning in a lock. There's one more thing you should know. The man who came to my door this afternoon with the message about the copies. She paused in the doorway. He said he was sent by Lord Chamberlain Westcott. Serafina waited. He also said that if you wanted to know who had been feeding your movements to Westcott's office from inside your circle of trust. Adeline turned. Her face was careful and steady and very sorry. It wasn't Dobbins who identified your sources. Dobbins only knew Adrian's schedule. The sentence completed itself in the space between them without needing to be spoken. Serafina felt the cold move through her. Not the cold from the broken window, not the cold of the rain-dark alley. The specific cold of a thing you had not let yourself suspect because suspecting it would have meant suspecting everything, and some calculations were too expensive to run until you had no other choice. How long? She said, very quietly. 3 months, Adeline said. At least. 3 months. The working group. The Thursday evenings. The questions she'd asked and the documents she'd sourced, and the shape of everything she'd been building, shared not just with Adeline and Gethwick and Mrs. Carver, but with one other person. One person she had brought inside the architecture of this case because she had looked at him with her most careful attention and had decided he was exactly what he appeared to be. She stood up from the table. Get the coat, she said. Her voice did not shake. She made sure of it. And tell me the Mercer Street address. Because there was no version of tomorrow night that looked like the version she'd planned. The version she'd planned was dead. What was left was a woman who had just been stripped of every structural advantage she'd built, standing in a borrowed kitchen at midnight with 36 hours, and the precise, terrible freedom of someone who had nothing left to protect except the thing that mattered most. The Crown Prince's name. And whatever it cost her to protect it, she was going to pay it. The coat Adeline gave her was gray wool, plain cut, the kind that disappeared in a crowd because it made no claim on anyone's attention. Serafina put it on and stood in the narrow hallway while Adeline wrote the Mercer Street address on a slip of paper and then burned the paper after Serafina had read it twice. You're not going tonight, Adeline said. It wasn't a question. Tomorrow, the Thursday arrangement. She was already organizing the hours, what she needed, what she could obtain, what she was going to have to do without. Tonight I need to know who it was. Adeline looked at her. Are you certain you want to know tonight? Knowing changes how you move through the next 36 hours. I've been moving through the last 4 months with incomplete information, Serafina said. I'm done with that. Then think, Adeline said. I'm not going to say the name. You say it. She thought. 3 months. The working group had been running for 6 weeks, which meant the leak predated it. What predated the working group was the period immediately after the Gazette announcement, the period of her rebuilding, of the park, of the careful reconstruction of a life that had been organized around someone else's trajectory. 3 months ago, she had been raw and exposed in ways she hadn't fully accounted for, which meant whoever had turned had identified the window and moved through it. 3 months of her sources, 3 months of Adeline's contacts, 3 months of everything she'd gathered flowing in one additional direction she hadn't sanctioned. She went through the list of people who had known enough to damage her. Adeline, who was standing in front of her and whose sorrow was the sorrow of someone who had already identified the answer and was waiting for Serafina to arrive at it without being handed it. Gethwick, who was elderly and had spoken to her once, and whose exposure was limited to a single conversation. Mrs. Carver, who had no connection to anything political. The working group members, but she had been careful about what she shared there and with whom. And then the person who had been inside the architecture from the beginning. The person she had told about Thornfield, not as a presentation of evidence, but as a live disclosure, in the moment it was still forming, because she had assessed them with her most careful attention and concluded they were safe. The person whose connection to Westcott's office she had not thought to examine because she had been too busy examining everything else. Hargrove, she said, the former diplomat, the man who had served in the Valdenmoor legation, the man who had been in the working group from the start, who had made observations about Valdenmoor's debt architecture that she had found useful, that Lucian had found useful, that she now understood had been specifically designed to be found useful, positioned to build trust, to establish himself as the member of the group most aligned with her thinking, most likely to be consulted privately. The man whose access to her sources she had not adequately traced because she had been grateful for his expertise. Adeline said nothing. The silence confirmed it. Serafina stood in the hallway for exactly as long as she needed to. She felt the specific quality of the betrayal move through her, not as heat, not as the dramatic internal combustion that the situation might have warranted in someone less practiced at receiving difficult information, as cold, as the flat, final cold of something becoming permanently past tense. Then she said, "What does he know about Mercer Street?" "I don't know." "Assume he knows everything I know. Which means if I approach Westcott's Thursday arrangement through any method Hargrove has seen me use before, any source he's been aware of, any contact he could have flagged, they'll be expecting it." "Yes." "Then I go alone," she said. "No preparation they can anticipate, no methodology they've mapped." Adeline looked at her for a long moment. "You go alone into Westcott's private arrangement with no support and no exit strategy." "I go with the one advantage I have left," Serafina said. "They don't know what I know about Mercer Street. Hargrove knew I was closing in on Westcott. He didn't know about your contact in the archive office because I hadn't told you about the Thursday arrangement when he was last in a position to be listening." She pulled the gray coat closed. "They've spent 3 months mapping my methods. They haven't mapped this one because this one doesn't exist yet." She left before Adeline could tell her again what she was walking into. She already knew what she was walking into, Oz. Fenwick Street was quiet when she arrived. Mrs. Carver opened the door before the second knock with the alert expression of a woman in her 70s who had spent 6 decades sleeping lightly and had made a virtue of it. Adrian was already there. He was sitting in the front room with a cup of tea he hadn't touched, in the specific posture of a man who has been sitting with his own thoughts for an hour and hasn't enjoyed a single minute of it. He stood when she came in. She looked at him. The gray wool coat was still on. She hadn't decided yet whether she was staying. "Hargrove," she said. Something moved through his face. He had gotten there himself then. He'd had the hour to think, and he'd arrived at the same place. "I introduced him to the working group," he said. "Lucian asked me for suggestions for the Eastern Trade Working Group before he'd met you. I recommended Hargrove because of his Valdenmoor experience." "When was that?" 4 months ago. Before the working group started. Before—" He stopped. "Before the Gazette announcement. Before Princess Isadora. Before 7 years compressed into a single cold morning." "Hargrove was your recommendation," she said. "Not as accusation, as the final piece of the geometry placed." Yes. She sat down. Not because she'd decided to stay, but because the sitting was suddenly necessary. She looked at her hands, still steady, which she had made sure of. You recommended him because you trusted his Valdenmoor expertise, she said. And then someone reached out to Hargrove, or had already reached Hargrove, and Hargrove understood that the easiest way to monitor what I was building was to be inside the room where I was building it. And I put him in the room, Adrian said. You put him in the room. She looked up. This isn't about blame. I need you to understand that clearly. Blame is an expense I can't afford tonight. I'm telling you because you need to know the complete picture of what happened and because you're going to help me fix it. He looked at her. Something shifted in his face. Not relief, not yet, but the specific quality of a man who has been sitting with the certainty that he has permanently disqualified himself from being useful and has just heard for the first time that a different conclusion might be possible. Tell me what you need, he said. Tomorrow night, she said. Westcott's Thursday arrangement on Mercer Street. I'm going in. I need you to do 2 things and only 2 things, and if you deviate from either of them by a single step, you will make everything worse. Tell me. First, Lucien, tomorrow afternoon. You find a way to reach him that bypasses every official channel, every staffed entrance, every attendant. You tell him, in person, directly, no written message, that Mercer Street, Thursday, 9 o'clock. He needs to be positioned outside the building with whatever discreet authority he can bring without making it an official event. He'll understand why. And if he wants to know more, he won't ask for more. Tell him that Lady Vale says the evidence is live and the window closes at 9. Adrian nodded. The second thing. Hargrove, she said, tomorrow morning before you do anything else. You invite him to your house. Whatever pretext, you've found additional material about the Valdenmoor situation. You want his expertise, whatever he will believe. You keep him there until I send word. You want him out of position. If Hargrove knows I'm moving toward Mercer Street before I arrive, there is no Mercer Street. There's only another closed door and another 3 days I don't have. She held his gaze. Can you do both of those things exactly as I've described them? Yes, he said. No elaboration, no negotiation. The word with all the weight of a man who understood that this was the specific and narrow form of useful that remained available to him. Then go home, she said. Get some sleep. Tomorrow matters more than tonight. He stood. He moved toward the door and then stopped, his hand not quite on the frame. Serafina, he said. Not the way he'd said it at the reception, not the way he'd said it in the garden corridor. The way a person said a name when they had stripped everything else away, and the name was all that was left. I know this isn't the moment for it, but when this is over, whatever over looks like, I need you to know that I am aware of the specific and complete shape of what I've cost you, not just recently, across 7 years. She looked at him in the lamplight of Mrs. Carver's front room, this man she had loved, which was the honest word for it even now, even after everything, because what she had felt had been real regardless of what he had done with it. Love didn't require its object to be worthy of it. That was one of the things that made it expensive. I know you know, she said. Good night, Adrian. He went. She stayed on Fenwick Street, and when Mrs. Carver brought her a second cup of tea and asked no questions at all, she sat with it in the quiet room and thought about Thursday until the thinking became a plan, and the plan became something hard enough to carry into the next day. But Thursday moved the way days moved before something irrevocable, simultaneously too fast and with the particular sluggishness of hours that knew themselves to be significant. She spent the morning at a public records office 3 streets from Verinder Lane, in the company of a clerk named Voss, who had been introduced to her 2 years ago by a woman she no longer trusted, but whose introduction still stood. Voss had access to the secondary property registration archive, which was not the official archive, but the one that held the records of transfers that had happened adjacently to official channels, the kind of transactions that powerful people used when they needed something documented, but not prominently visible. The Mercer Street property had been transferred to a holding company 11 years ago. The holding company's registration listed 3 directors, 2 of whom were names she recognized as shell identities, common practice, no information value. The third name was Lord Edmondson Crail, which was the family name of Thornfield's maternal line, which was not in any of the documents she'd been building her case from, which meant it was the thread she hadn't pulled because she hadn't known it was there. She sat with that for a moment in the archive's thin morning light. Thornfield owned Mercer Street, not Westcott. Westcott came to Mercer Street the way a subordinate came to a location the principal controlled, because the principal had specified it, because the principal wanted visibility over who entered and who left, because the principal understood that the safest meeting place was one that you owned and your counterpart didn't know you owned, which meant Thursday night was not a Westcott arrangement. It was a Thornfield arrangement, and Westcott was the attendant. She understood now why the 3 days had felt like a gift. It wasn't generosity. It was Thornfield timing the pressure to coincide with a meeting he already had scheduled, so that whatever resolution occurred when evidence destroyed, woman neutralized, could be confirmed in person at Mercer Street on a Thursday. She was not, she realized, walking into the subordinate's operation. She was walking directly into the center. She thought about that on the walk back to Fenwick Street, thought about whether it changed the calculation, and concluded that it changed the risk in the specific way that made the whole thing either significantly more valuable or significantly more lethal, and that she would not know which until she was inside. Both things were true simultaneously. She went anyway. At 8:30, she was on Mercer Street, a block north of the address, with the gray coat and no knife. The knife would have been taken from her, and the taking would have told them something she didn't want them to know yet. She had 3 things: the address, the specific memory of 4 months of documentation she could reproduce from recollection if necessary, and the quality that Adeline had once described, a long time ago, as the thing that makes you either very dangerous or very foolish, and no one can tell which until the end. The house was narrow-fronted, like half the buildings on this street, with nothing marking it from the outside except the particular quality of its darkness. Not empty darkness, occupied darkness, the darkness of a building where the interior lights had been arranged to show nothing from the street. There was a servant's entrance on the south face. She had walked the perimeter once before taking her position, cataloging the exits the way she cataloged everything, measuring the space between what was presented and what was true. She went to the servant's entrance at 20 minutes to 9. A man she didn't recognize opened it. He was large in the specific way of men employed for their size rather than their intelligence, and he looked at her with the flat assessment of someone processing an unexpected variable. "I have information for Lord Thornfield," she said. "Tell him it's regarding the Vale matter. Tell him she came herself." The man's expression didn't change, but something behind his eyes did. The specific recalibration of someone receiving information that falls outside the briefing they were given. She had counted on this. Thornfield had prepared for a response to his threat. He had not prepared for her to walk through the door herself. The man said, "Wait." He went inside. She waited. The cold was complete and the street behind her was quiet, and she felt her pulse with the particular clarity that arrived in the body when it understood that it was operating near the edge of its tolerance, that the next 30 minutes would require everything she had without the luxury of knowing in advance whether everything she had would be sufficient. The door opened again. "This way," the man said. She went in. The interior was better appointed than the exterior suggested. The kind of house that saved its quality for the inside, for the people who were meant to see it and no one else. Dark wood paneling. Lamps turned low. The smell of tobacco and old money, which smelled different from new money in ways she had learned to distinguish years ago. She was taken to a room at the rear of the first floor. Not a receiving room, a working room, with a large table covered in documents, and the kind of chairs that were built for long occupancy rather than brief visits. Westcott was there. He looked exactly as he had in every official context she had seen him. Compact, neat, with quick, intelligent eyes that were currently moving over her with the precise attention of someone revising a threat assessment in real time. And Thornfield. The Duke of Thornfield was 63 years old and had the specific physical quality of a man who had never had to exert himself in any visible way because the exertion had always been done by other people at his direction. Silver-haired, broad through the shoulders, with the settled, unhurried air of someone who had been the most powerful person in every room he'd entered for 3 decades, and had simply internalized it as the natural state of things. He looked at her. He didn't stand. "Lady Vale," he said, "I'll admit this isn't the approach I anticipated." "I know," she said. "That's why I used it." He studied her with the slow, complete attention of a man who had assessed a great many people across a long career and who was now taking the time to revise an assessment he'd already made. "Sit down," he said. "I'll stand." Something almost like appreciation moved across his face. Almost. "You came here alone?" "Yes." "Without the evidence?" "The evidence doesn't need to be in the room," she said. "The evidence has been somewhere specific and safe for 4 months, and it will remain there regardless of what happens tonight, which is something you should factor into whatever you're planning to do in the next 10 minutes. Westcott shifted in his chair. Thornfield did not move. "What you're describing," Thornfield said, "is a woman who has walked into a room with nothing to trade." "What I'm describing is a woman who has already made the trade and is here to confirm the terms," she said. "The copies your people made of my documentation, the ones Westcott threatened me with, they're only useful if there's a dispute about authenticity. You can surface altered copies, yes, but you can only successfully discredit the originals if the originals are presented without support. And if they're presented with support, then the copies become evidence of the fabrication, and the fabrication becomes part of the case against you." She held his gaze. "I came here tonight because I wanted you to understand that the window you thought you had closed yesterday, not the 3-day window you offered me, the larger window, the one you've been operating in for 8 years. Thornfield looked at her for a long moment. The room was very quiet. Westcott had gone still in the particular way of a subordinate watching their principal navigate something and trying to calibrate whether they should intervene. "You're bluffing," Thornfield said. "You don't believe that," she said. "If you believed that, you wouldn't have sent 3 men to my house on Wednesday night." Something shifted in his face. Not fear. Men like Thornfield didn't arrive at fear directly. Something before fear, the specific precursor quality of a man who has just understood that the person across from him is operating from information he didn't know they had. "The support you mentioned," he said slowly. "It's already positioned." "The window closes at 9 o'clock, she said. He looked at her. She looked back. The clock on the mantelpiece behind him read 8:52. And then Westcott stood up very suddenly, and his eyes went to something behind her, and Thornfield's jaw tightened with a specific quality that was the closest thing to alarm she had ever seen on a face that had spent 60 years not allowing itself to be alarmed. And she turned, because not turning would have been worse. Hargrove was in the doorway. Not contained by Adrian, not held at the townhouse on whatever pretext Adrian had used. Standing in the doorway of Thornfield's working room on Mercer Street at 8:52 on a Thursday night, with the expression of a man who had just confirmed something he'd suspected. He looked at Serafina. His face held the specific quality of the genuinely regretful, not performed regret, the real kind, the kind that didn't change anything but was nonetheless present. "She's been talking to Lucy Yen," he said to Thornfield, "directly. Whatever she's positioned outside, it's the Crown Prince." Thornfield turned back to Serafina, and what was in his face now was no longer the settled, unhurried air of 3 decades of uncontested power. It was the face of a man who had just understood that the correct move was the move he had never once in 60 years been required to make. He stood. He was very large when he stood. The room reorganized around his size in the way rooms did when the person who controlled them decided to fill them completely. "Lady Vale," he said, "whatever you think you've built, whatever you believe is waiting outside that door, you are one woman. You have been one woman this entire time, without office, without title, without the institutional standing that makes a claim uncontestable. I have been in this government since before you were born." His voice was not loud. It didn't need to be. "You cannot win this." She looked at him. She felt her pulse. She felt the specific cold of the room, the lamplight, the 8:53 on the mantelpiece clock, the 7 minutes that stood between this moment and whatever came next. She thought about her mother, who had taken up very little space, who had compressed herself until she became dense and less yielding and ultimately very small. She thought about Lucien's voice, saying her name without the title, saying "be careful," saying something more than careful, saying "I've never put conditions on the truth." She thought about what it had cost her to walk into this room, and whether that cost was the kind that could be recovered or the kind you simply carried forward. "You're right," she said. "I'm one woman." She reached into the pocket of the gray coat, not a weapon. She had told herself no weapon, and she had kept that. What she removed was a single folded document, which she set on the table between them without ceremony. That is a certified copy, she said, made this morning through the official Public Records Archive, under my signature and the registrar's seal of the property transfer documentation for this building, linking the Crail family holding company to your maternal line and linking the holding company's activity over the past 11 years to 6 documented meetings with individuals currently under separate parliamentary inquiry for succession interference. She held his gaze. It's not the full case. It doesn't need to be. It is enough to open an inquiry that you cannot close, because the property registration is public record and cannot be altered, and I signed my name to the certified copy this morning, which means my name is already in the official archive connected to this document, whether I leave this room tonight or not. The clock read 8:56. Thornfield looked at the document. He looked at her. Something moved through his face that was past the precursor stage now. It had arrived at the destination, the real destination, the one that 60 years of power had insulated him from ever having to visit. Westcott said very quietly to Thornfield, "We need to—" "Don't," Thornfield said. To Westcott, not to her. The single word of a man communicating with the only other person in the room whose response he was currently managing. He looked back at Serafina, and she understood in that moment, in the specific quality of his silence, in the way his hand rested on the table beside the document she had placed there, in the 4 minutes remaining on the clock behind him, that he was making a calculation, the same kind of calculation he had made for 60 years, weighing the cost of action against the cost of inaction, measuring the risk on both sides of the scale, arriving at the place where the only remaining question was which loss was the smaller one. The door at the back of the room opened, not Hargrove's entrance. The other door, the one she had catalogued on her way in as the interior connection to the ground floor rear passage, the exit she had identified and considered and deliberately positioned herself away from so that she would not appear to be watching it. The man who came through it was not one of Thornfield's people. Lucien was never early to anything, she had learned in 6 weeks of Thursday evenings. He arrived at exactly the stated time. The clock read 9 o'clock. He stepped into the room, and behind him, just visible in the doorway, were 2 men in plain clothes who wore the specific quality of alert stillness that distinguished trained protection from hired size. He took in the room in a single movement: Thornfield, Westcott, Hargrove in the opposite doorway, the document on the table, Serafina standing at the center of it all in Adeline's gray coat. And then he looked at her, and what was in his face was not surprise. He had trusted her enough to come. He had trusted her enough to come exactly on time, to the right door, through the rear passage she had specified in the message she had sent through the one channel Hargrove had never known about, with exactly the support she had asked for, and nothing more. She had told him the window closes at 9. He had believed her. Thornfield looked from Lucien to Serafina, and then back to Lucien, and the calculation that had been running behind his eyes for the past 4 minutes reached its conclusion, and the conclusion was written clearly in the specific compression of his jaw, the stillness of his hands, the quality of a man who had just understood that the board had been turned and the pieces were no longer in the positions he'd spent 8 years arranging. "Your Royal Highness," Thornfield said. "Your Grace," Lucien said. His voice was entirely even. "Please sit down." Thornfield sat, and Serafina looked at Lucien across the room, across the table and the document, and the 60 years of embedded power currently folding itself into a chair, and Lucien looked back at her. And what passed between them in that 4-second exchange was the specific and complete understanding of 2 people who had just arrived at the same place from different directions, and found, against the considerable odds of the past 72 hours, that they were still standing. Then Westcott's hand moved beneath the table, and the lamp went out. This is a work of complete fiction created purely for entertainment purposes. Darkness had a specific texture in a room where people had been holding power over each other. Serafina felt it the way she felt temperature, as information, as something to read and respond to rather than simply experience. Westcott had reached for the lamp with the deliberate intention of someone who had planned for exactly this failure point. The darkness was not panic, it was protocol. She dropped to the floor before the sound of the lamp going out had finished its echo. The room erupted. Not in the theatrical way of staged violence, in the specific, ugly, human way of 4 people and 2 protection officers moving in absolute darkness through furniture that did not care who it was inconveniencing. She heard Westcott's chair scrape hard, heard the rear door, Lucian's entrance, hit something solid, heard one of the protection officers bark a single syllable that was less a word than a signal. She stayed low and moved right, toward the wall, away from the table, because the table was where everyone's body memory was pointing, and the wall was where no one was going. She felt the paneling against her palm, moved along it toward where the door to the interior corridor had been. 8 feet. She had measured it unconsciously when she entered. She was certain of 8 feet. Hargrove's voice, from somewhere near the opposite doorway. She's moving. She didn't run. Running made sound. She moved fast and low and quiet along the wall and counted the feet and found the door handle at 7.5, not 8. Close enough. Pushed through into the corridor. Lamp in the corridor. Low, but present. She blinked against it. Behind her, the room was still in motion. She heard Lucien's voice for the first time, sharp and commanding in a register she hadn't heard from him before. And she understood that the man she had seen asking careful questions at Thursday evening working groups was also capable of being, when necessary, a completely different instrument. She turned toward the rear of the corridor. Westcott was already there. He had moved faster than she'd given him credit for, through a route he knew and she didn't, and he was between her and the rear passage exit, and in his hand was a document case she recognized. Not her document, the certified copy she'd placed on the table, but something else. Something he'd had with him the entire time. The specific shape of a man who had prepared his own exit before the meeting began. She looked at him. He looked at her. "That case," she said. "You should have taken the 3 days," he said. His voice had a quality she hadn't heard in it before. Not anger, something flatter. The voice of a man who had been in service to something larger than himself for so long that the service had replaced the self entirely. This didn't need to happen this way. "What's in the case, Westcott?" "Correspondence," he said. 20 years of it. Every instruction Thornfield sent through my office, every response. He held the case against his chest with both arms, the gesture of someone holding something they intended to die holding. "I have been Lord Chamberlain for 20 years, Lady Vale. I have watched this government from a specific position of comprehensive visibility for 20 years. I know where every letter went and what it authorized and who received the benefit." She was very still. "You've been keeping records," she said. "Your own records, independent of what I've been building." "I am a civil servant," he said. "I document things. It is what I do. It is perhaps the only coherent thing I have done." Something moved through his face. "I reached the Thornfield materials 2 years ago. I understood what they meant, and He stopped. "I was not brave enough to bring them forward. That is the precise and complete truth. I lacked the courage to do alone what you walked in here tonight and did with nothing but your own name and a piece of public record." The corridor was very quiet. She heard the door behind her open. One of the protection officers, checking the corridor, finding her standing at the far end facing Westcott. He stopped. She held up one hand without turning. "Wait." And he waited, which told her something about what Lucian had said to these men before tonight. "Westcott," she said, "give me the case." "If I give you the case," he said, "I am finished. Every protection this position has given me for 20 years. If you don't give me the case," she said, "Thornfield manages the narrative of tonight, and you are finished regardless. The only difference is whether you finish as a man who handed over evidence or a man who withheld it." She held his gaze. "You said you lacked the courage to do it alone. You're not alone right now." He looked at her for a long moment. His arms stayed where they were. Then they moved. He held the case out. She took it. It was heavier than it looked, which she supposed was appropriate. She walked back toward the room. Well, the room had a lamp again. One of the protection officers had found a secondary light on the far shelf and brought it to the table. In its light, Thornfield sat in the same chair Lucien had asked him to occupy, and the sitting had done something to him. The 60 years of settled, unhurried authority had not vanished but had shifted, had revealed underneath it the specific thing that authority always covered when it was finally stripped back. The ordinary human fact of a man who had made a great many choices over a long time and was now in the same room as their cumulative weight. Hargrove was gone. She registered his absence without surprise, A man who had operated as an intelligence conduit understood the precise moment when the intelligence flow reversed direction and understood that the correct response was to remove himself from the geography of consequence as quickly as possible. She would deal with Hargrove through proper channels, with documentation, without the urgency of tonight. He was not the center. He had never been the center. Lucien was standing at the head of the table. He looked at her when she came through the door, looked at the case in her hands, looked back at her face. She set the case on the table. Lord Chamberlain Westcott's personal records, she said. 20 years of Thornfield's correspondence passed through the Chamberlain's office. She looked at Lucien. Combined with what I've been building for 4 months, there is no version of a formal inquiry that produces a different outcome. Lucien's gaze moved to Thornfield. Thornfield looked at the case. He looked at it for a long time. The specific quality of that looking was something she would not forget. The way a man examined the physical object of his own undoing with the same attention he might have given a mathematical proof, searching for the error, finding none. "Your Grace," Lucien said. His voice had returned to the register she knew from Thursday evenings. Not the sharp command of the darkened room, but the particular steadiness of a man who had inherited the duty of being certain when everyone around him wasn't. "I want to be clear about what happens next, not as a threat, as a fact." Thornfield said nothing. "The inquiry will be formal and complete. Every document in that case and every document Lady Vale has secured will be entered into evidence. The succession amendment you arranged 8 years ago will be reviewed and reversed. The individuals who acted as intermediaries in the coordination with external interests will be identified and prosecuted." He paused. "What happens to you specifically will depend on what you choose to do between tonight and the morning. That is the only variable that remains in your control." Thornfield looked up. "You're offering me a choice." "I'm telling you one exists," Lucien said. "I'm not offering you anything." Thornfield looked at Seraphina. She met his gaze without accommodation. Not with triumph. She hadn't arrived at triumph yet. Wasn't sure she would. The night was still too raw and close for the kind of emotional resolution that triumph required. What she held instead was the specific, clear-eyed steadiness of a woman who had walked into the center of something very large and had not been consumed by it. "You're not what I expected," he said. "I know," she said. "When Hargrove told me about you, months ago, in the early days, he said you were formidable, but that you were operating from a position of personal injury, that the Blackthorn situation had motivated you but also exposed a vulnerability, that you were building something, but that you were building it the way a woman builds things when she has been given no official ground to stand on, carefully, quietly, with the awareness that one wrong step would allow the whole thing to be dismissed." He looked at the case on the table. He was right about the method. He was wrong about the vulnerability. "He mistook grief for weakness," she said. "It's a common error." "Yes," Thornfield said. "I suppose it is." He stood. He straightened his coat with the automatic precision of a man who had maintained his appearance as a form of discipline for 6 decades, and whose body performed the gesture without consulting his mind. He looked at Lucien. "You'll have my full cooperation," he said, "in the morning, through my solicitor." "Tonight," Lucien said, "my officers will remain with you." A muscle moved in Thornfield's jaw. Then he nodded, once, and the protection officer near the door moved to his position, and the thing that had been the Duke of Thornfield's operation in this room was over. Westcott came in from the corridor. He sat down without being asked. He looked at the document case with the expression of a man who has put down something he carried for 20 years and is feeling simultaneously lighter and entirely without orientation. "You'll need to make a formal statement," Seraphina said to him. "I know," he said. "Tonight, if possible. Before—" "I know," he said again. "I'll do it tonight." She left him with one of the officers and walked to the window at the far end of the room, the one that looked out onto the back of the Mercer Street property, onto the dark garden and the wall and the alley beyond. The city sat beyond all of it, doing what cities did. Continuing, indifferent, large. She stood there and let herself feel the shaking. It came now because she had given it permission, because the performance was over, and the room was handled, and the only person behind her who mattered was Lucien, who she could feel crossing the room toward her without hearing his footsteps because she had learned, in 6 weeks of Thursday evenings, the specific quality of his presence in a space. He came to stand beside her at the window, not behind her, beside. They stood in silence for a moment that lasted long enough to mean something. "The rear passage," she said. "How did you find it?" "You specified it in the message," he said. "The message said rear approach. It didn't specify the passage." "I looked at the building's exterior on my way down Mercer Street," he said. "There was one location on the south face where the foundation stones showed a different material than the surrounding structure. Older. A later addition, bricked over. The passage behind that face was the only logical interior route that didn't surface in the main corridor plan." She looked at him sideways. "You assessed the structural history of the building while walking past it." "I thought it might be useful." A pause. "It was useful." She almost smiled. She felt the edge of it, the specific warmth of it, which was something she had spent 6 weeks carefully not fully allowing, and which tonight, in this room, with the case on the table and Thornfield under escort, and the city going about its business beyond the glass, she was too tired to continue not allowing. "Yes," she said, "it was useful." He looked at her. In the lamplight from behind them, his face was the face she had been learning for 6 weeks. The stillness, the amber-green eyes, the quality of a man who was genuinely interested in what was actually happening, which was rarer than it should have been and which she had recognized immediately when she first encountered it. "Serafina," he said, without the title. The way he had said it once before in a study on Aldrich Crescent, and which she had told herself she would not think about, and had thought about every day since. "Don't," she said very gently. "Don't what?" "Don't say whatever you're going to say in this room. In this specific room, tonight, with Westcott giving his statement 12 feet away." She looked back at the window. "Whatever it is, say it somewhere that doesn't have Thornfield's furniture in it." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "That's a reasonable position." "I have them occasionally." "More than occasionally," he said, and the tone of it was the closest thing to unguarded she had heard from him, the specific warmth of someone who had stopped managing their expression without quite noticing they'd stopped, and it landed somewhere in her chest with a weight that was not unpleasant. She said nothing. He said nothing. They stood at the window while behind them, Westcott's voice began its quiet, comprehensive accounting of 20 years, and outside the city moved through its Thursday night without any awareness of what had just been settled inside one of its narrow, unremarkable houses. The morning came in stages. The formal statements were recorded at a government office on Aldrich Crescent at 2 a.m, in the presence of a magistrate who had been roused from bed with the kind of authority that only the Crown Prince's personal request could generate at that hour without creating additional complications. Westcott spoke for 3 hours. He was precise and comprehensive and without self-pity, which was the version of him she hadn't expected and which she thought might be the version that had been waiting for 20 years to exist without the weight of what he'd been carrying. Thornfield's solicitor arrived at 6. The formal cooperation began at 7. She was not present for most of it. Her part, the part that required her specifically, her presence, her documentation, her 4 months of accumulated work, was completed by 3:30 a.m. when the magistrate reviewed the combined case material and said, with the specific gravity of a man who understood the weight of what he was looking at, that an inquiry would formally open within 48 hours. She walked home as the city was beginning its earliest sounds. The first carts on cobblestones, the particular cry of a pre-dawn bird she had never successfully identified, the gas lamps burning through the last of the dark before the light made them redundant. She let herself into the house on Cresthaven Row. The study window was still broken. The cold had settled into the room, and the fire was long dead, and the walnut box sat on its shelf behind the agricultural surveys, undisturbed. She sat in the cold room and looked at nothing in particular and felt the specific quality of a thing being over. Not triumph. She had been right that it was too raw for triumph. What it felt like, sitting in the cold of her own study at 4 a.m. with a broken window and a dead fire, was something closer to what she imagined silence felt like to someone who had been living with sustained noise for a very long time. Not peace exactly. The structural absence of a specific tension, the way a muscle felt after you finally put down something you'd been carrying longer than your body was designed for. She thought about her mother. She did this regularly now, brought her mother into the thinking not as grief, but his conversation, the way you continued a conversation with someone after the words had stopped being possible. She thought about what her mother would have made of tonight, of a daughter who had walked alone into a room full of 60 years of embedded power with nothing but a certified copy from a public records archive and the specific quality of a woman who had decided she was done with being carefully invisible. She thought her mother would have found it excessive and extraordinary and entirely correct. She thought she would have been proud. The cold was significant by the time she heard the knock. Not the front door, not the side entrance. The front door plainly, which meant it wasn't Lucienne, because Lucienne understood by now that certain approaches required certain doors, and the front door meant someone who was operating within normal conventions. She answered it herself. The footman was still asleep. Adrian stood on the front step in the gray early light. He looked like a man who had not slept. Not because the sleeplessness showed in his face specifically, but because the specific quality of what was in his face told her he had spent the night with his own thoughts and had arrived here having finished the accounting. Hargrove came to my house at midnight, he said. He needed somewhere to go. I let him in. She looked at him. Where is he now? I've been with him for 4 hours, Adrian said. He told me everything. His arrangement with Thornfield's people, how long it had been running, what he passed to them. All of it. He held her gaze. He's prepared to make a formal statement, this morning. I told him I would bring him to wherever the formal process was happening. Aldrich Crescent, she said. The government office. The magistrate will still be there. He nodded, started to turn. Adrian. He turned back. She looked at him in the early light. This man she had loved for 7 years, and who had taught her across those years, and specifically across the past 3 weeks, the precise difference between devotion and respect. She had given him devotion. She had managed his vulnerabilities and absorbed his limitations, and made herself useful in ways that asked nothing visible of him in return. She had been, in the vocabulary of their particular 7 years, devoted. He had never learned to respect her. Not fully. Not in the way that required you to see the complete dimensions of someone and acknowledge them without adjustment, without the slight narrowing that occurred when another person's capability began to feel like a claim on your own adequacy. He was learning it now. Too late to be what it might have been, and she was clear-eyed enough about herself to acknowledge that there was grief in that. Real grief. Not performed. The genuine loss of a possible future that had felt for 7 years like the most likely future. But grief was not the same as wrong direction. What you did on Wednesday night, she said, with the letter, with coming here and keeping me in the house. I know, he said. I'm not saying it to revisit it. I'm saying it because I need you to understand that what you did, and what you did afterward, bringing Hargrove in, sitting with him for 4 hours, coming here this morning, those are not the same category of action. The first was cowardice. The second was something different. He was quiet. I'm not sure yet what the second is, she said, but I think you should know that I see both. He looked at her with the face she had spent 7 years learning, the specific compression around his eyes that meant he was receiving something he hadn't anticipated and was deciding not to defend against it. Serafina, he said, I don't expect anything from you. I want to be clear about that. I'm not here for anything except to do the part I can actually do. I know, she said. That's why I opened the door. She gave him the address and watched him go. And then she went inside and got the fire going in the study and sat in its warmth while the broken window let in the morning cold. And she allowed herself, for the first time in 3 weeks, to simply be in the room she was in without preparing for what came next. The inquiry opened formally on a Saturday. The documentation was accepted in full. The succession amendment was suspended pending review. Thornfield was remanded to his estate under a restriction order that had not been issued against a peer of his rank in 40 years, which the Gazette reported with the specific breathless quality of journalists encountering something their style guide had no established template for. Hargrove cooperated. His statement corroborated Westcott's on every material point. He would face consequences proportional to his specific role, which was significant but not the center. He had been, like Perrin, like Adrian in his limited way, a person who had been used by the architecture rather than the architect. The center held. 3 weeks after Mercer Street on a Tuesday morning, Serafina received a note on plain paper in Lucian's handwriting. Not on royal household paper. His own hand, his own words. no ceremony. It said, "There is a garden at the east face of the palace that no one uses on Tuesday mornings. If you happen to be there at 9, I would not be surprised." She read it twice. She looked at the window, which had been repaired, which caught the November light cleanly and made the room warmer than it had felt in weeks. She went. The garden was as described, small, walled, with the particular quality of a space that had been designed for intention and then forgotten by everyone except the person who had rediscovered it. Late-season roses, most of them past their moment, but a few hanging on with the specific stubbornness of things that didn't acknowledge the calendar. Stone paths. A bench set into the east wall that caught the morning sun with the precision of something placed by someone who understood angles. Lucian was already there. He was standing at the center of the garden with his hands in his coat pockets, and his face turned slightly toward the sun, which made him look less like the crown prince and more like a man who had gotten up early and found a quiet place to think and was very glad the quiet place was warm. She came through the gate. He heard it and turned. They stood in the garden for a moment without speaking. The city made its sounds beyond the walls. A bird she could not identify made its sound in the rosebush nearest the bench. "You said somewhere that didn't have Thornfield's furniture in it," he said. "I did say that." "This room has no furniture at all. I considered that might be overcorrecting, but then I decided that given the specific quality of the past 3 weeks, a complete absence of interior furnishing was probably appropriate." She looked at him. She let herself look at him fully, without the management she had been applying for 6 weeks, the careful calibration of her own response to him. She let herself see what she had been seeing every Thursday evening and refusing to fully acknowledge because the timing had been wrong and the situation had been wrong, and there had always been another reason to wait. The timing was still not straightforward. The situation was still complicated in the specific way that situations between a crown prince and a woman without official standing were always complicated. Those things were real. But she had spent 7 years waiting for the timing to be right, and she had learned something specific about waiting. It did not improve the underlying situation. It just delayed the moment of reckoning, which arrived anyway, on its own schedule. "Lucien," she said, using his name for the first time without the title. She watched what it did to his face when she said it, and what it did was the thing she had thought it might do, and she was glad she had said it. "Yes," he said. "Whatever you were going to say that night, in Thornfield's room, before I told you not to say it in there." "Yes," he said again, and this time it wasn't a response to a question. It was the answer to everything that preceded the question. The entire 6 weeks of Thursday evenings, and morning parks and documents and amber-green eyes, and the specific quality of being seen by someone who had no obligation to see you and chose to anyway. She walked across the garden to where he was standing. She stopped when she was close enough that the conversation could be quiet. "I need to tell you something first," she said. "Tell me. I am not who I was 7 years ago. I'm not the woman who stood in the dark corners of ballrooms and swallowed her own capacity to make someone else more comfortable. I don't know how to be that woman anymore, and I don't intend to learn again." She held his gaze. "Which means whatever this is, it will require you to see me completely. Not the version of me that is useful to your working group, or the version that is convenient to your political position, or the version that can be explained to the court in terms that create the least complication. The complete version. That's the only version I have left." He looked at her for a long moment. The sun was on his face and hers, and the garden was very quiet. "Serafina," he said, and the way he said it carried every conversation they had had and the specific quality of a man who had been paying attention the entire time. Not to the version of her that was useful or convenient, but to the woman who had walked into Thornfield's room alone with a certified copy and her own name and had made it enough. "That is the only version I have ever been looking at." She felt it. She let herself feel it completely, which she had not done with anything in a very long time. And it was not comfortable exactly. It was something rawer than comfort, something that required a steadier floor than comfort did. But the floor was there. She was sure of it. She did not close the distance between them immediately. She stood in it for another moment and let the moment be what it was. Two people in a cold garden in November who had arrived at the same place through entirely different kinds of damage and had found, against the weight of everything the past 3 weeks had contained, that the place they'd arrived at was solid. Then she closed the distance. A year later. The inquiry concluded. The succession amendment was formally struck. Thornfield faced a parliamentary tribunal whose proceedings were long and thorough and whose outcome confirmed what the original documentation had established, which was that 60 years of embedded power, when examined with sufficient rigor, left a very long and very clear trail. Westcott was granted a conditional release from formal prosecution in exchange for the totality of his cooperation, which had been complete. He retired to a house in the countryside. Serafina thought of him sometimes, not with warmth exactly, but with the specific acknowledgement of a person who had held something difficult for 20 years and had finally, at the last possible moment, put it down. Hargrove's formal statement became part of the parliamentary record under his own name. His consequences were proportional. He did not contest them. Adrian's engagement to Princess Isidora dissolved 6 months after Mercer Street, when the Valdenmoor political situation shifted in the direction Serafina had identified through her mother's old contacts, rendering the alliance's strategic value significantly less than it had appeared. The Gazette reported it with diplomatic brevity. She heard it from Adeline, who still opened her door at 6 in the morning and still asked no unnecessary questions. She had not spoken to Adrian since the morning she sent him to the magistrate's office with Hargrove. She thought she might, eventually. She thought the conversation that they had been trying to have, Ichi, the real one, the one beneath all the other ones, might still be worth having when enough distance had accumulated that it could be received without the interference of everything that had happened around it. That was not yet. It might be a long time yet. She did not need it to be soon. The working group on the Eastern Trade Architecture continued on Thursday evenings. Its membership had changed somewhat. There was a new diplomatic analyst in Hargrove's former chair, a woman who had served in the Eastern Legation and who asked questions with a precision that Serafina found genuinely useful. Dr. Ravenswood still argued with her about historical precedents. Lady Isolde Marchmont still knew the operational reality better than any theoretical framework could capture, and Lucy Sien still asked good questions. That had not changed. She suspected it would not change because some qualities in a person were not circumstantial. They were simply the structure of how that person moved through the world, the fixed points around which everything else arranged itself. She had learned to trust fixed points. She had learned to distinguish them from things that looked like fixed points and were actually load-bearing performance, the kind that held until the weight became real. She sat at her writing desk on a November morning, in the study with the repaired window, with the light coming in clean and steady from the east. There was correspondence to answer. 3 letters about the Education Trust, which had expanded in the past year to 17 additional scholarships and was now attracting the kind of institutional interest that suggested it would continue expanding without requiring her to personally sustain it. A note from the Meridian Institute about the spring lecture series. A letter from a young woman in the country she had never met, who had heard about the Thornfield inquiry and wanted to know if Lady Vale was the same person who had appeared in the parliamentary testimony, and if so, how one went about learning to do what she had done. She picked up that letter last, read it twice. The young woman wanted to know how one went about learning to do what she had done. She thought about that for a while. She thought about what the answer actually was, stripped of the narrative that had formed around the events of the past year. The inquiry, the Gazette articles, the parliamentary record, all of it, stripped of the version that became a story. The answer, she thought, was something closer to this. You start with what you actually know, not what you've been told to know, not what the people around you have deemed it appropriate for you to know. What you have genuinely, specifically, thoroughly learned through attention and time and the refusal to look away from difficult information simply because receiving it cost you something. And then you put your name on it. You stand in the room with it. You do not wait for the timing to be better because the timing does not improve on its own. You do not wait to be chosen before you choose. She put the letter down. She picked up her pen. She thought about what she wanted to say and how to say it without making it larger than it was, without the kind of retrospective smoothing that turned lived experience into instruction. Then she wrote, "Start with what is true. Keep your name on it. That is the whole of it." She set the pen down. The morning light was warm on the desk, and the city was doing what cities did, and somewhere in the east wing of the palace, a man with amber-green eyes was probably in the middle of a conversation he was conducting with the specific quality of someone genuinely interested in what the other person was actually saying. She was going to see him this evening. Thursday. She folded the letter, she addressed it, she set it with the others for the morning post. Then she sat in the quiet of her own study, in the house on Cresthaven Row that still smelled faintly of dried lavender and old paper and everything she had inherited and survived and rebuilt. And she felt the specific weight of a life that was entirely and completely her own. It was heavier than she had expected. It was exactly the right weight. Outside, November went on doing what it did, cold and clear and proceeding without permission, the way the real things always did, the way survival always had, the way she had come, through everything, to understand love finally must, not as a thing you waited for in the dark corners of someone else's light, but as a thing you carried into the room yourself, in the gray coat, with your name already on it, with the window closing in 8 minutes, with nothing guaranteed except the solidity of the ground beneath your feet and the specific quiet certainty that this time you had chosen to stand on your own. That was how it ended. Not with thunder, not with the formal resolution of every wound, with a woman at a desk in November light, writing one true sentence to a stranger, and finding that the sentence was enough.